Welcome to Sola Church Online.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers. Together, we are launching a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California this fall, 2021. While waiting for LA County to reopen, we launched online. So glad you've joined us. If you're watching on the Church Online platform, you can click Invite to send a link to someone.
And if you're watching on Facebook, you can share this to your timeline.
On YouTube, click subscribe to catch all the new material coming out of Sola Church.
So, Alan, we are launching in Santa Monica. We now live in Santa Monica. And lots of people are wondering, why Santa Monica?
You know, gosh, we love Santa Monica so much. I mean, it's such a beautiful city. The people are so fun. The food is amazing. Like, it's just a beautiful place. You know, we have a background in LA. I lived in LA growing up for a while. And as part of the music industry, you've spent lots of time in and around LA. We feel an affinity with all of the creatives. Like, that's part of what's so amazing about Santa Monica is all the people that work in the creative fields. And even in terms of business, like all the startups and the incubators, the whole Silicon Beach vibe is just so cool. It's such a fun and amazing thing. And so that's a big part of it, you know, but also we really care about what's happening in Santa Monica. As there are people that are hurting. There are people that are lonely. There's despair. There's people with suicidal thoughts. There's this undercurrent in the midst of all this beauty and all this excitement. There's also this undercurrent for some of despair and hopelessness. And we just believe that God wants to do something really, really special on the west side.
Amen. Let's worship.
Survive when we praise you. The God of introduced me to your love. You picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my all I did was praise. All I need to do is worship. Lord, I will just bow down. No, I'm just gonna stay still.
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you are checking us out today, please don't feel obligated to give. But for those who want to worship in this way, there's a link in the chat feed. It'll open a separate window so you don't miss anything. You can always go to the website, right? People can go to solachurch.live and click give. You can make a one-time tax-deductible donation or schedule a recurring gift. Some prefer PayPal. The email address you'll need in that case is give@solachurch.live. So thank you so much for your generous giving. It enables us to do church online each week, and each week it gets us a step closer to being able to purchase all the things that we're going to need to do portable church beginning sometime in the fall. So we really appreciate you guys.
Right, and Alan, our first in-person startup party is right around the corner now.
Yeah, sadly at the time that we're filming this, the date is still to be announced. You guys know that because we were in the middle of a move, we had to pre-record several services. So be sure again to check our website, check our social media. It's possible that before this airs, we'll not only have the date, but be able to either drop some text in on the screen. You might see that now. Or we might be able to create like another video element that will drop in like right after the announcement. So who knows what will happen next? Keep watching. But that's possible. In any event, this hour-long event is going to be amazing. Most of the time will actually be just meeting each other and mingling. But near the end, you and I, of course, will give our presentation. We'll cast vision for Sola Church. We'll invite you to be a part of that. You'll have the opportunity to fill out a response card. It's going to be super fun.
And as far as who can attend, anyone in West LA, anyone within driving distance who wants to be a part of launching this life-giving church in Santa Monica, right?
Totally, yeah. Not only will we be there, but members of our launch team will be there. People who have attended virtual startup parties certainly can be there. We want you there. We want you to bring your family. We want you to bring your friends.
And to register, you go to solachurch.life, click Attend a Startup Party. And with that, let's get into our time of teaching.
Let's turn again in our Bibles to Judges chapter 10. We're in this message series called Heroes. We're studying the highlights of the Old Testament book called Judges. And so in this series, we've been inspired by the stories of both women and men called judges who did heroic things with their lives. But it's not just about their story, it's about yours. Heroes is the series that asks the question, what's your story? What does it look like for you to live heroically in this moment? So we're picking it up in chapter 10 and verse 6. It says, "Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the gods of Syria, Sidon, Moab, Ammon, the Philistines, and they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the people of Ammon. It says from that year they harassed and oppressed the children of Israel for 18 years. All the children of Israel who were on the other side of the Jordan in the land of the Amorites in Gilead. Moreover, the people of Ammon crossed over the Jordan to fight against Judah also, against Benjamin and against the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was severely distressed. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, we have sinned against you, because we have both forsaken our God and served the Baals. So as we've been learning, the book of Judges sees this recurring cycle where the people sinned and suffered, and then they cried out and were delivered. And in verse 6 it says, then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. Then, when? Well, after 4 cycles, making this the 5th cycle, at least as it relates to the major judges. So in verse 6 it says that they forsook the Lord. 4 times in the Bible it says that God will not leave you nor forsake you. It says it in the Old Testament and it says it in the New. I love that. When Jesus was on the cross, one of the things that he said from the cross was a prayer. He actually said to God, why have you forsaken me? And we know that Jesus was forsaken in that moment so that we need never be forsaken. It speaks to our abandonment issues. If you've ever been abandoned by a parent, if you've ever been abandoned by a spouse, if you've ever been abandoned by a friend, well, again, this speaks to our abandonment issues. Though we forsake God, he never forsakes us. So anytime that it seems like God is distant, it's not God who moved. Now notice in verse 7 this reference to the anger of the Lord. By one count, the word anger is found 455 times in the Old Testament, and of those, 375 refer to God. Now you might say, well, that's the Old Testament. Okay, let's talk about the New. In Mark 3, verse 5, it says that Jesus looked at the Pharisees with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. So you might be thinking, okay, so he won't abandon us, but he gets angry with us? Well, that's a good question, but I would just say that God's anger is an expression of his love. Like when our kids do something incredibly dangerous and maybe they have a close call and we're so upset that they might have been hurt or that we might have lost them, that, maybe we react angrily, but underneath that is just this love for them and this genuine concern for their well-being. I think that's the idea in Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12, when it talks about God disciplining us. It says, my son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction, for whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as a father, the son in whom he delights. So, if right now in your life you're being chastened, if you're being corrected, it's just a sign that you've got a dad in heaven that loves you. Were you ever paddled at school? Obviously, that's not as common today, if at all, as it was back in the day, right? Like I was paddled at school. I was paddled twice in one day. How about that? Anybody else ever get paddled at school twice in one day? Yeah, I got in a fight, and so me and the other kid both got sent to the principal's office where we both got paddled. And he took us back to our classroom. On the way, I was replaying in my mind this conversation that I'd had with my mom. We'd had our issues with this particular school over the course of that academic year. And so sometime before this, my mom had said to me that we should tell them that we've had a stomach full of all we can take. Now, my guess is my mom did not mean for me to repeat that any place, much less at school. But as I was walking in that hall, I'm on one side of the principal, my opponent on the other side. We're walking back to the classroom after getting paddled. I'm trying to work up my nerve. My eyes are watering. My bottom lip is probably quivering as I work up the nerve to say, my mom said to tell you that we've had a stomach full of all we could take. I got paddled again. That's right. The other kid got dropped off at the classroom. I got taken back to the principal's office for paddling number 2. Well, the children of Israel got paddled once also. In verse 7, first they got paddled by the Philistines, and then they got paddled by the Ammonites. But check this out. Who got paddled first? In verse 8, it says, all the children of Israel who were on the other side of the Jordan, that is, on the eastern bank. in the land of the Amorites, in Gilead. We talked about this last week, so I'll summarize it briefly, that when after the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, when the children of Israel went to conquer the land that God had promised to them, 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh, they compromised and settled on the east bank in this region known as Gilead. And so we talked last week about how that kind of compromise often leads to complacency. But here I want to make the point that compromise invites correction. And not only that, but it often puts others at risk. When I live in such a way, when I'm compromising, so I'm living in such a way that a loving dad in heaven has to discipline me, sometimes that presents problems for the people around me, the people who care about me, the people who depend upon me. So these guys, they were the first to experience this paddling from the Philistines and the Ammonites. But as a result of that put the enemies within striking distance of Judah on the other side of the Jordan. They could attack all of the central tribes from that point. So here's what I want to challenge you to think about. That is that what you're doing today may hurt someone else tomorrow. What you're doing this week or this month may hurt someone else next week or next month. What you're doing this year may hurt someone else next year. What you're doing in this season of your life may hurt someone else in the next season of theirs. Well, in verse 10, we find out that it's not until after 18 years that they dial 911. And so look at verse 11. It says, "So the Lord said to the children of Israel, did I not deliver you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites and from the people of Ammon and from the Philistines? Also the Sidonians and Amalekites and Moabites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, and I delivered you from their hand. Yet you have forsaken me and served other gods. Therefore I will deliver you no more. Go and cry out to the gods which you have chosen. Let them deliver you in your time of distress." So they prayed for a hero and they got 0. This is what we sometimes call unanswered prayer. When we pray something and it doesn't happen, or we get it or we don't get it, we say that it was unanswered prayer, but that's a misnomer. In this particular case, God answered them. He just said no. He probably did that through a prophet, as he did in chapter 6, verse 8. But God responds with a history lesson. And it's a reminder that while we're not to live in the past, we are to learn from it. What has your personal history taught you about God? And like in this moment of your life, what lesson learned do you need to keep at the forefront of your mind? In verse 15, it continues. It says, "And the children of Israel said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do to us whatever seems best to you. Only deliver us this day, we pray." So they put away the foreign gods from among them and served the Lord, and his soul could no longer endure the misery of Israel. Then the people of Ammon gathered together and encamped in Gilead, and the children of Israel assembled together and encamped in Mizpah. And the people, the leaders of Gilead, said to one another, "Who is the man who will begin the fight against the people of Ammon? He shall be head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." So, in talking again about so-called unanswered prayer, we know that if the request is wrong, God says no. If the timing is wrong, God says slow. If we are wrong, God says grow. And so it's important to keep in mind that slow and grow don't necessarily mean no. They just mean wait. To put it another way, we often say that God's delays aren't always God's denials. But if the request is right and the timing is right and I am right, then God says go. I love how in verse 16 it says that his soul, that is God, could no longer endure the misery of Israel. Reminds me of how parents who are disciplining their children will sometimes say, "This hurts me more than it hurts you." When you're a kid, that's hard to understand. But as a parent, that is absolutely true. It is a very painful thing when we have to discipline our children, when we have to decide on consequences for, maybe something that they've done. But I love that, at this point, we see God responding to them. We see him responding in mercy, not giving them what they deserve. We see him responding in grace, giving them what they do not deserve. The only problem at this point is that there's no one to lead. And as John Maxwell famously said, everything rises and falls on leadership. So with that, we move right into chapter 11. Now Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty man of valor, but he was the son of a harlot. And Gilead begot Jephthah. Gilead's wife bore sons, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out and said to him, "You shall have no inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." Then Jephthah fled from his brothers and dwelt in the land of Tob. And worthless men banded together with Jephthah and went out raiding with him. So we get this flashback as we're introduced to the next hero, to the next judge, this man named Jephthah. Notice in verse 1 that he was the son of a harlot. So when his father, Gilead, died, he was disowned and driven out by his half-brothers. Listen, for everyone, I mean, if you are someone who has family of origin issues, like you have ongoing issues with your family of origin, then Jephthah's your guy. You know, if you grew up as, or if even now you're part of a blended family, you know, because of death or divorce and remarriage, you know, maybe you grew up with, half-brothers, half-sisters, step-brothers, step-sisters, then Jephthah's your guy. He was driven out. It says in verse 3 that he landed in a place called Tob. Tob was on the frontier. So I want you to think in terms both literally and figuratively of Jephthah being out on the edge, out on the fringe, out on the margin. You know, if you have been disenfranchised, if you've been marginalized, if you find yourself suddenly in the out group, if you've become an outlier, then Jephthah's your guy. He puts together a new band of brothers. They were like Hebrew Robin Hoods. You know the Robin Hood story. Robin Hood, Sherwood Forest, taking from the rich to help the poor, all of that. I actually got to go mountain biking in the Sherwood Forest. And of course, I just had to do an endo and a face plant. For real, I preached the next day with a busted lip. But at least I can say I went mountain biking in Sherwood Forest. So these guys, again, were like Hebrew Robin Hoods, and like Robin Hood, they became local heroes. Their reputation spread far and wide. So in verse 4, it says, "It came to pass after a time that the people of Ammon made war against Israel. And so it was, when the people of Ammon made war against Israel, that the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah from the land of Tob." I love this. "Then they said to Jephthah, 'Come and be our commander, that we may fight against the people of Ammon.' So Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, 'Did you not hate me and expel me from my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress?'" Why now, he wants to know. "And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, 'That is why we have turned again to you now, that you may go with us and fight against the people of Ammon and be our head over all the inhabitants of Gilead.' So Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, 'If you take me back home to fight against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivers them to me, shall I be your head?' And the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah, 'The Lord will be a witness between us if we do not do according to your words.' Then Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And Jephthah spoke all his words before the Lord at Mizpah." I love how Jephthah emphasized the Lord. You can notice that in verses 9 and 11. This emphasis on God, this focus on God, well, it makes me think about what Jephthah learned on the edge, at the fringe, in the margin. You know, if that's where you find yourself, as it's a place where I found myself as a divorced and remarried Christian, I've certainly found myself in that place, on the edge, at the fringe, in the margin, an outlier. Well, it makes me think about how God forms the heart of the outsider. It's in that place that God gives us new abilities. It's in that place that he uses new experiences to prepare us to live heroically. Listen, Jephthah's time in Tob was not wasted, and neither is yours or mine. We want to just overview the next block of verses, but I'll read the first couple. I'll read verses 12 and 13. "Now Jephthah sent messengers to the king of the people of Ammon, saying, 'What do you have against me, that you have come to fight against me in my land?' And the king of the people of Ammon answered the messengers of Jephthah, 'Because Israel took away my land when they came up out of Egypt, from the Arnon as far as the Jabbok, and to the Jordan. Now therefore restore those lands peaceably. So at issue was a land claim. They've been fighting over this land for a long time, right? They're still fighting over this land. But I love that Jephthah was more than a fighter, he was a diplomat. I love that before he fights, he talks. That before he tries to be understood, he tries to understand. That's good advice for all of us. You know, if you need to have some hard conversations, if there's someone that you need to share your heart with, and that you feel the need to be understood by, try first to understand. Try to ask good questions and to listen first. So after he's heard them out, he then begins to share. And he makes the point that it's not their land, verses 15 through 22, that in fact it had previously belonged not to them, but to the Amorites. In verses 23 and 24, he makes the point that God had given it to them. You know, he's recognizing that in the ancient world, people saw battles over land as like a referendum on their gods. You know, that the winner's God was victorious over the loser's God. So it's kind of a my God can beat up your God type thing. Verse 25, he makes the point that there's no precedent for what they're wanting to do here. And in verse 26, he makes the point that it's too late. It's been roughly 300 years since the events in question. And so picking it up in verse 29, it says, Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he advanced toward the people of Ammon. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. Check this out. He said, If you will indeed deliver the people of Ammon into my hands, then it will be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the people of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. Now, in verse 29, we see that Jephthah was empowered by the Spirit. I love that. He's not the first judge or the last that it says this about. That's a good thing, but then a bad thing, he made a vow in verses 30 and 31. Now, actually, that was a very common thing, especially, in ancient times, especially for a commanding officer before going to battle. I talked before about their thoughts about, God's role in these battles over land and so forth. So it was not unusual for a commanding officer to be, kind of bargaining with God to try to get a victory. Have you ever promised God? Have you ever said to God, I'll never do that again, or promised, if you get me out of this, I'll do this, or give that, or give up this other thing? It's a bad idea. I mean, the Bible doesn't prohibit making vows to God, but neither does it encourage it. And it tells us that if we do it, we better keep it. So it's a bad idea. A better idea is to simply ask God for help. He wants us to do that. He invites us to do that. And so verses 32 and 33, Jephthah advanced toward the people of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord delivered them into his hands, and he defeated them from Aroer as far as Minnith, 20 cities, and to Abel Keramim with a very great slaughter. Thus the people of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. So, the description of the battle itself is short and sweet. After all this buildup, it's short and sweet, which would indicate that it's not really the point of the story, almost an aside. But notice then in verse 34 what happens. When Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and dancing, and she was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. So she learns about the victory, and she comes out of the house doing her "my dad can beat up your dad" dance. Some people want to know whether people of faith can dance. Like specifically, can Christians dance? The answer is some can and some can't. You've got to drop a dope beat to find out. But don't forget Jephthah's vow. Remember what he vowed in verse 31? Whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it as a burnt offering. Uh-oh. So look at verse 35. And it came to pass when he saw her that he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me. For I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot go back on it. So she said to him, My father, if you have given your word to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, because the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the people of Ammon. Now, just in brief, Jephthah blames his daughter in verse 35. How weird, right? Like the language sounds like blame. It sounds like blame shifting. It is a funny thing when we as parents sometimes blame our kids for things that are entirely our own fault. But as for his daughter in verse 36, well, she brings to mind Isaac in Genesis 22. We looked at that story together. I think it was back in December. You could go back on our YouTube channel at Sola Church LA and check that out. But what she does here, it's almost like she's channeling her inner Isaac in terms of her submission to God and to her father. But look at verse 37. Then she said to her father, "Let this thing be done for me. Let me alone for 2 months, that I may go and wander on the mountains and bewail my virginity, my friends and I." So he said, "Go." And he sent her away for 2 months, and she went with her friends and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. Now, let me speak plainly. Let me be as clear as I possibly can. You know, she wasn't sad that she was going to die before she'd had sex. She was sad that she was going to die before she'd had children. In ancient Israel, the greatest aspiration of young women was to be a mother. So many times in the Bible, it's like a recurring theme. We see women who were unable to have children and who were just devastated by that, as are many women in modern times. It's very painful and a very difficult thing. But that's what she was grieving. She was grieving the loss of this dream of motherhood. So with that in mind, let's look at verses 39 and 40. And it was so at the end of 2 months that she returned to her father, and he carried out his vow with her, with which he had vowed. She knew no man. And it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went 4 days each year to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite. What actually happened? Was this a human sacrifice, or is there another explanation? Well, in verse 31, when he made the vow, if you look again at that, I want you to notice exactly what it says. He says, and at the end, "And I will offer it up as a burnt offering." So here's what you've got to know. Everything I just read translates 2 words. There is a Hebrew verb and a Hebrew noun. There is no conjunction. So the translators have to decide what conjunction best fits the context. And it's entirely possible. Some scholars have suggested that in place of "and," we should read "or." Let me read it that way, and then let me parenthetically, insert the meaning. So in that case, we would read it like this: "Whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me shall surely be the Lord's," that is, if a person, "or I will offer it up as a burnt offering," that is, if it is an animal. So if Jephthah wasn't going to actually sacrifice his daughter, in what sense was she to be the Lord's? It's possible that this is a reference to what we know as serving women. There were serving women at the tabernacle in Shiloh. Before there was a temple, there was a tabernacle. At this time, at the time of our story, it was in Shiloh. We read about these serving women before this in Exodus 38, verse 8. We read about these serving women after this in 1 Samuel 2, verse 22. So it's entirely possible that the sense in which she would be the Lord's is that she would join the serving women at the temple, which apparently meant that she wouldn't marry or have children. In verse 40, the Hebrew verb that's translated "to lament" isn't necessarily positive or negative. It doesn't necessarily suggest something sad. The verb simply means to recount, to rehearse, or to tell again. It could well be that what they did each year was to commemorate this sacrificial dedication of her life to serving at the tabernacle, that they even celebrated that in some way. What are some reasons to think that this or something like this was what Jephthah had in mind and what he did as opposed to a human sacrifice? Well, from verses 12 through 18, that is, we know that Jephthah had a working knowledge of the Torah, in which God prevented and later prohibited human sacrifice. Also, the fact that people had 2 months in this story to put a stop to it. There's a similar story in 1 Samuel 14 involving King Saul and his son Jonathan, in which the people were very quick to put an end, a stop to Saul doing something similar to his own son. Keep in mind too that the law said that such a sacrifice, any sacrifice, had to be offered at the tabernacle. You couldn't just do it any place you wanted to. You had to do it at the tabernacle. So had he taken his daughter to the tabernacle, there's no way that the priests would have gone along with it. And both he and they would have known that he didn't have to, that the law actually allowed for you to buy back that thing that you were otherwise obligated to offer to God. So he could have actually redeemed her, quote unquote, with the spoils from the battle. Also, why would she bewail her virginity? Which again, we understand to mean to grieve not getting to be a mother. Why would she grieve that and not her death? Like, as devastating as it would be for someone who wanted to be a mother to not get to do that, how much more devastating would it be to die? I would point out also that later the prophet Samuel, as well as the author of Hebrews, probably Paul, they speak well of and not poorly of Jephthah. On the other hand, there are those people who think that he did actually offer his daughter as a burnt offering. They would argue that it seems to be the plain meaning of the text. If you simply read this Bible story without digging any deeper, you would likely take it that way. And in fact, almost all early writers understood it that way. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that other points of view, like the one I've presented today, actually came into view. And of course, it's true that twice in the book of Judges it says that this was a time when, quote, everyone did what was right in his own eyes, end quote. So I'm going to let you decide what to make of that. Personally, I feel pretty comfortable with the idea that she was not in fact killed. She was not in fact offered as a burnt offering, but she instead joined the serving women at the tabernacle. But certainly it was a foolish vow to make. And it was an even more foolish vow to keep. For me, as the father of two daughters, had I been foolish enough to make such a vow, I certainly wouldn't have been foolish enough to keep it. I would rather have faced the consequences personally of breaking that vow than of keeping it. And I think the problem is often what we don't know about God. We just don't understand the character and the nature of God to think that he would want us to promise such a thing, much less to actually go through with it. One of the great problems today is this idea that, I like to think that God is this, and I like to think that God is that. As if you've been to the mall, right? And you've seen the Build-A-Bear store where you choose your bear and you choose the eyes and the nose and whether it's going to have a squeaker inside of it or a little recording, a voice recording inside of it. Well, some of us act like there must be a Build-A-God store, and we can just create this God however we want to, instead of understanding that God has revealed himself to us in his word. And it's as we get to know him here that we understand his true character and his true nature. Well, one last vignette, and then we're through. But just look at this first part of chapter 12. Then the men of Ephraim gathered together, crossed over together toward Zaphon, and said to Jephthah, why did you cross over to fight against the people of Ammon and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you with fire. Okay. And Jephthah said to them, my people and I were in a great struggle with the people of Ammon, and when I called you, you did not deliver me out of their hands. So when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivered them into my hand. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me? Now Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim. And the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim, because they said, you Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim, among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. I guess that's how they talked trash back then. The Gileadites seized the fords of the Jordan before the Ephraimites arrived. And when any Ephraimite who escaped said, let me cross over, the men of Gilead would say to him, are you an Ephraimite? If he said no, then they would say to him, then say Shibboleth. And he would say Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they would take him and kill him at the fords of the Jordan. There fell at that time 42,000 Ephraimites. And Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried among the cities of Gilead. So not again. Like, this is just like last week. The Ephraimites are upset with Gideon. Now later they're upset with Jephthah. For the Ephraimites, it was all about them. It was always all about them. Now, unfortunately for them, Jephthah was no Gideon. You know, although Gideon handled things poorly after that, he handled that particular situation with the Ephraimites really, really well. Jephthah did not handle it nearly as well, certainly not as diplomatically. And so as they tried to flee, you know, we read about how they had to pass this test. You know, if they denied that they were, you know, one of the soldiers fleeing, they had to say this word shibboleth, and they couldn't say it. You know, as you travel around the country, you discover that, you know, there are regional dialects, right? Like, you know, even though in the United States, we may speak English in each part of the country, we don't necessarily speak it exactly the same way. We don't pronounce every word exactly the same way. You know, I grew up in California, in New Mexico, in Texas, and so I've got little bits of all of those. Wherever I am, they always pick up on the other places. If I'm in Texas, they think I'm a Californian. If I'm in California, they think I'm a Texan. But in this particular case, the Ephraimites could not make the sh sound. They could only make a s sound. So when they were asked to say shibboleth, no matter how hard they tried, and you know they tried hard, their life is on the line. Beads of sweat running down their face as they try as hard as they can to make the sh sound, but instead it still comes out shibboleth, and they were killed. You know, Jephthah was definitely rough around the corners, wasn't he? And, you know, he might be an example of someone who has more heat than light. You know how we use those words metaphorically? A lot of times we use heat for like love, for passion. And we use light for like insight, for understanding, for enlightenment. And it could be that while Jephthah had lots of heat, he was passionate about his mission, but he was lacking light. Like, he really did need more insight, more understanding. He needed to become a more enlightened person. What about you? You know, it is a struggle to live heroically if we're way more heat than light. We need some light. But it is also hard to live heroically if we are way more light than heat. Like, some people have lots of insight and lots of understanding. They're enlightened in some sense, but there's just no passion. There's no fire. They don't do anything with it. God help us to find the sweet spot. God help us to find that spot where there's both heat and light, where we have that love, we have that passion, we have that fire, but we also have that insight, that understanding, that enlightenment. Remember, as we say each week, each time, this series, these stories, it's not just about their story, it's about yours. Heroes is the series that asks the question, what's your story? What does it look like for you to live heroically in this moment? Do you need more heat to do that? Do you need more light to do that? Maybe you need both. Let's pray right now. Father, I just pray that we could have all the heat and all the light as we step into heroic living. I pray that on the one hand, we would have the insight and the understanding that we need about you and about the world around us, about what you're doing in this world. But I pray too that we would have all the heat that we need, that there would be in us a fire, that we would want to be part of what you're doing in this world, to take an active role in it, to allow you to work in us and through us in a way that would glorify you, in a way that would just bring good things to the people around us. That's our prayer today. It's my prayer for those who've joined us online. I raise it, lift it up to you now in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
And now it's time to fill out a connection card.
You should see a link in the chat feed, but people can always go to the website, solachurch.life, and click contact. That's where the connection card lives. That's your way of letting us know that you attended online today. You can also tell us there if you'd like to participate and a virtual small group. We love those, right? It's like a highlight of the week each week. You can join the launch team there. You can even request more information about the next startup party.
And also, you can keep up with everything that's going on at Sola Church by going to the website, solachurch.life, or you can check out all our social media at Sola Church LA. And we hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.